Good morning. It's good to see this number out this morning. We've got some visitors with us. We're certainly grateful for your presence. So for those that are visiting with us, we are in the midst of a 3.5-year study through the Bible from Genesis to Revelation, and we are this morning studying from 1 Samuel beginning in chapter 11 and going through chapter 15. So we're kind of in the period of what I would call the turn of Saul's kingship, as we kind of see a change in attitude and a change in conduct from what we have studied in our last lesson with Saul. But before we begin, we will be beginning with question 12, and I do have questions on the screen for those that are visiting, but let's review once again our 17 time periods. So before the flood, the scattering of the people, the patriarchs, the Exodus, the wandering in the wilderness, invasion and conquest, the judges, the united kingdom, the divided kingdom, Judah alone, the captivity, return from captivity, years of silence, the life of Christ, the early church, letters to the Christians. And again, just as way of reminders, we are looking at the life of Saul right now as we are in the middle of the beginning of the United Kingdom. Saul is going to be 1 Samuel 10 through 31 and also 1 Chronicles chapter 10. David will be all of 2 Samuel and then 1 Chronicles 11 through 29. And then Solomon will be 1 Kings 1 through 11 and then 2 Chronicles 1 through 9. So picking right up with our questions on question number 1 from lesson 2, what can we learn from the beginning of Samuel's address to the people, and why would he question the people about himself? What application can we make from Samuel's initial questions in 1 Samuel chapter 12, verses 1 through 5? So in that passage, Samuel is declaring his innocence before the people, and so he asked the people if he had defrauded them in any way, if he had taken a bribe or if he had oppressed anyone, that they could say so, but they all agreed to the integrity that Samuel had in his faithful service of them, and that he had served God in full integrity. So what can we take away from that? What do we learn from that?
We should be the same way.
Okay. So how would you describe just his initial set of questioning? And what do you think what's the purpose of it? What does it tell us about Samuel himself?
If he had cheated anybody or if he had hurt anybody and all that, he was questioning his duties as...
Okay. Jesse?
I mean, he's putting himself out there, his character, his life. It's for public record. It's not a haughty thing, but it's just here I am, and if there's some blemish or some misdeed, wrong I've done to you, speak up, please.
Yeah, I don't think there's any sense of haughtiness. I think it's probably humility, but it's also accountability. I think that he's opening himself up before the people to receive any form of admonishment or rebuke maybe, but he is showing the integrity that he had throughout his time as their leader. And I think that it kind of shows us as well, like he's doing this to the people and giving them this opportunity, and they had a role in this. And I think that, Ken had said we should do the same. Well, I think that as a group of Christians, we have to make sure that we're holding our leaders accountable, ensuring that they are leading with all godliness and righteousness, and no leader should be above being questioned by the people. And so I think that if we are leading with integrity, and the people have a responsibility to make sure that their leaders are leading with integrity, and if they are not, they should speak up. And he is offering this opportunity to do that. Norm, do you have your hand up? Go ahead.
Yeah, it kind of reminds me of the tack that Paul took in defense of his apostleship later on in the New Testament, and we see him going over and nobody should be, if you're doing the right thing, you shouldn't be afraid of your record. It's only when you're doing the wrong thing that you got something to, to cover up, to hide, and all of that. And so, and again, you have the situation where false teachers many times will put out a false story about somebody else, and there may be people that's all that they've ever heard, but the truth will set you free, so to speak. And sometimes the only people that can speak that truth are the people that are directly involved.
Yeah, I had that in my notes. I think Norm's talking about Acts chapter 20, verses 17 through 35, where Paul is kind of declaring his integrity before the people and the way that he had proclaimed the gospel. But why else do you think that he would be questioning the people about his own integrity and the way that he had led them, just because of the situation that they were in, or what they had asked for? Francis?
Well, he wants to make sure they understand where he is, and he wants to know where they're at.
Okay. So Miss Shirley said they had asked for a king. So he's also letting them know, you're asking for a king. It has nothing to do with me. I have, and you've admitted to this, I've led you with all integrity. I've served God with all faithfulness. And this is your own desire because you want to be like the world. And so I think there's probably a bit of reflection of, okay, this is what you've asked for, not because of any lack of leadership on my part and obviously on God's part as well. So just some things that I think we need to think about, and I think Ken is right. We should do the same. And so one of the things that are a different word as opposed to integrity that we read about in 1 Timothy chapter 3 and Titus chapter 1, we've talked about it with appointment of elders. We've talked about it now with looking at the appointment of deacons, but there's a B word that's pretty important. They must be blameless. All right, this is Samuel. He is standing before them blameless, and this is leaders in the church as well. They should be blameless. I think it's also important that we hold ourselves accountable and we hold others accountable, and that's something that we need to be reminded of. All right, anything else on number 1? Go ahead, Todd.
Curious, in verse 5 it mentions his anointed. How do you read that? Who's he referring to there? Himself?
He said to them, the Lord is witness against you, and his anointed is witness this day that you have found nothing in my hand. And they said, he is witness. That's the way that I read it. He is standing before them in that situation. And we know that he was God's anointed as a prophet and as a leader, as a judge, before they actually had a king.
That's interesting. It's the same Hebrew word for Messiah. And of course, Jesus also says, which one of you convicts me of sin?
Yeah. That's a good connection. Anything there on number 1? Number 2, how would you summarize Samuel's farewell address, and what's the overall point? What does Samuel's farewell speech reveal about his character and his relationship with God? So I think the beginning of it, obviously we just discussed in the first 5 verses with him reaffirming his integrity, but then just summarizing like the rest, what do we see there? Norm?
There's some similarities here with Joshua when he was making his final address. This idea of you got to take a stand on you're either on God's side or you're not. Okay, and he's going to leave them with that.
Oftentimes with leaders that are kind of having this address before the people, Samuel does something similar to what many of them do, and what is that? So what does he call back to?
Jacob.
All right.
He's reminding even Moses, but he's reminding them of the history of what they've come through, and then when you disobey God, that's when you get in trouble. Yeah, and they have such a long history, and oftentimes this is what
the leaders do, and they recount this history, reminding the people of God's faithfulness. You have acted a certain way, but they're constantly reminded and called to reflect on the way that God had remembered his covenant and had been faithful to them. And then with that, again, oftentimes what leaders do after they are reminded about their history, then what's given? So verses 14 through 25, how would you summarize that? Go ahead, April. Sorry, I couldn't see your hand.
Just basically that obedience equals blessings and disobedience equals curses.
All right, so there's a warning that's given, and that typically always follows with what is happening. And so Samuel makes it clear that they need to continue to follow God if they're going to continue to have these blessings, even with the fact that they have an earthly king. They still should be following God. So what do you think, if you were to just summarize either in a sentence or in a few words, what do you think the overall point of Samuel's address is?
It's time, and now you want a king. He's been your king. He's been the one that's been rescuing you from these enemies.
Yeah, it's another reminder that God is their king, God is their ruler, and I think if I was to just summarize it in like a sentence, God is all you need. And that's a reminder for them. It should be a reminder for us as well. And I think that just talking about even question 1 with this, as far as Samuel's character, I think that we've discussed it. It shows his humility, I believe, in the way that he approached his own actions before the people. Obviously, his faithfulness to God and how he had served God faithfully. But I also think that it shows an immense amount of concern that Samuel himself had for the people. And that goes to this selflessness and this humility, because he is so concerned for the people. And then I think that with that, one of the things that we have spent so many lessons with our young men, going back to 2019 when we started our young men's leadership training, is this idea of servant leadership. And Samuel is such a great example of that, because in all of this, this wasn't about Samuel. He wasn't looking out for his own glory. He wasn't looking out for his own interest, but his leadership was characterized by service in the interest of others, and viewing himself as a servant of God and seeking the good of the people and also seeking the glory of God. So I think that's something that Samuel is such a great example of. Norm?
Verse 22, it's a little different from what Joshua kind of gave the challenge and kind of left it there with him, but you can see the humanity and his love for the people here in verse 20 when he started. Basically, don't give up. You have messed up. You're going to mess up, but God is still there if you're willing to come back to Him. And it's a touching part of the message. It's not all bad news.
Yeah, I think that we see some of that as far as Samuel's humanity even in the next lesson, when we see his reaction to Saul and his mourning over that because of the time and effort that he had put into Saul. You see another glimpse of his humanity. Anything else on question number 2? Number 3, what were the reasons for Saul's disobedience in chapter 13? How well did he handle his sin? And what can we say about Saul's character from these events? So what were the reasons for his disobedience? All right, so in chapter 13, verses 7 through 12, he was afraid. He actually feared the people. Why else? Ken?
He became impatient.
Okay, so he was very impatient. We see that spelled out there in verses 8 and 9, and his lack of trust in God's timing. What else? What other reason do you think? Lena?
Distress or frustration because people were leaving him and he was losing his popularity.
Yeah. So we see from here and even throughout the story of Saul, So Lynn talks about him losing his popularity. That's something that was important to Saul. He was very concerned about what other people thought about him, and how does it look as a king when everybody is scattering and they don't have the strength to follow me. And so what goes along with that? What sin? The sin of pride. So Saul's pride is beginning to get in the way, and because of his own pride, he is now overstepping his boundaries. So whenever he's confronted with the situation, how well did he handle the situation? So how does he respond? He doesn't respond well. That's exactly true, right? But how does he respond, Francis?
Well, he always had an excuse, and he wasn't accepting any of the responsibility.
Yeah. This is it's just such a change in the first few chapters of the life of Saul to what we read in the last few chapters of the life of Saul, and it's something that it's like you can things can be going so good and things can go bad so quickly if you aren't in control of your own actions and taking accountability, kind of like we talked about with Samuel. And so, yeah, he's offering in his mind justification, okay, some pretty weak justification, and yeah, it's just excuses. But even there in verse 12, he says, "I forced myself. I didn't want to do this, but I forced myself. With everything that's going on, I had to do this." And so he made these excuses, showing that he was more concerned with the immediate circumstances than he was with his relationship with God. And yes, we're going to give Saul a hard time, but we do the exact same thing. And we get so concerned about the immediate circumstances, and I like to refer to it as situational ethics. Well, the situation, I know that I've always stood for the truth, and I've always held, this stance, but this situation has come up that really wasn't something I was quite prepared for, and so I need to change based on the situation. No, our ethics, our morals do not change based on the situation. We're always standing firm on what God says. Norm?
I liken this to the situation with Aaron and Moses and the golden calf incident in particular. But you can see similarities between Saul and Samuel and Aaron and Moses in that the one who's in charge at the time is supposed to be doing the right thing and the same thing as the leader would do, but in fact they're relying on that other person for their faith.
Yeah.
And every time they're by themselves, you can see their faith fails. It's just because they haven't developed their own.
Yeah, that's a good analogy, and we see that here with Saul, where he has this lack of faith, he has this lack of trust in God. Talking about his character, he has a lack of patience, as we've talked about, and he has a sense of impulsiveness that I'm not going. This situation has come up. Let me go to God and see what we need to do about it. No, he just impulsively acts. Linda talked about him and his popularity, so it's all about his self-interest and what is going to make sure that he continues to look good. And then obviously just a lack of true repentance with this excuse making. So continuing along with that thought, what strategies can we apply in our life today to avoid acting as Saul did? Francis?
I have pray to God, never go against His will, and ask for forgiveness when we sin.
Okay. So pray to God, ask for forgiveness. What was the second one?
Never go against His will.
Never go against His will. All right. So it's always going to be God's way and not our way. Norm and then Ken.
Focus on developing your own faith, and do it with a sense of urgency, realizing that if you're dependent on somebody's faith right now, whether it's parents or whoever, you need to cut that lifeline as soon as you can so that you can swim on your own, because you never know when you're going to be in that situation where you are now alone and you're going to have to use that tool.
Yeah, that's a good point, because Samuel is someone, obviously we've just talked about his blamelessness before the people. He's the one that spent so much time and effort into Saul. And I think that oftentimes, and we can see this even with parents and children, the leader or the parents can be so strong, but as parents, our responsibility is to make sure that our children are developing their own faith. They can't stand on our faith. Saul can't stand on the blamelessness of Samuel. He needed to have developed his own faith, which he obviously had not done. Ken?
Well, I just think it's a matter of taking responsibility for your own actions, not trying to blame others, and don't act presumptuously like he did in the case of this offering, this sacrifice.
Yeah, talking about parents and children, this is a child's mentality of making excuses, and I think that oftentimes they do justify it in their own minds, and I think that Saul felt, at least in the moment, he felt justified in what he did, and we definitely need to avoid that. Norm P.?
We need to remember the order in which things are set. God's at top, and Saul forgot that. And the blessings that Saul received by being selected to be the king of Israel, those came from God. And a lot of times when we get into success, just like Saul does, we forget God's the one in control. The only reason you're having the success is because he's given this opportunity to you to do it. And Saul apparently forgot all about the fact that he's king because God selected him.
When we talk about kind of the reasons why he made the decisions that he did, that oftentimes can happen to us as well when we aren't grounded in our faith and in our trust, and we're not grounded in God's Word. We begin making decisions out of fear or out of pressure. And when we are tempted to make those decisions, whether it's the fear of consequences that may come our way, or maybe it's the fear of somebody else's opinions and what they may think, or maybe it's even a fear of failure, when we make decisions based on those emotions, then more times than not, we're not going to make a godly and righteous decision. So we have to be mindful of that. Anything else on them? Go ahead, Todd.
I noticed in verse 14, he says he's seeking for a man after his own heart. That's the first time you see that phrase. And so whatever we conclude that David has being the man after God's own heart, we should also see Saul as not having. He's setting up that contrast. So it's, we see David's not a perfect man, but he certainly has a desire to be obedient. We see that all through his life. And then we also see a willingness to own up to his sins as soon as they're pointed out. And Saul just doesn't have that.
Yeah. That's one of the things, especially in our next lesson. You just see a stark contrast between Saul and David. You see a stark contrast even in Saul and his own son, Jonathan, in a lot of ways too. Go ahead, Norm.
And the other contrast between Saul and David is David started developing his faith very early, and he wasn't getting a lot of support in doing that necessarily, but he was taking it seriously, and whatever he was thinking about, he was putting it to the test daily out there with the sheep and obedience to his parents and all those things. Saul came about it very later in life, if at all.
Yeah. Anything else on number 4? Number 5, Jonathan acknowledges that God's deliverance does not depend on the number of people or resources available. How can we apply this truth to church or personal struggles today, and in what ways can we rely on God instead of our own strength or resources when facing challenges? And I think that this is just such an awesome verse there in chapter 14, verse 6. Then Jonathan said to the young man who was carrying his armor, "Come and let us cross over to the garrison of these uncircumcised. Perhaps the Lord will work for us, for the Lord is not restrained to save by many or by few." So what can we learn from that? Go ahead, Francis.
God is all powerful. If it's God's will, we will accomplish our goal and seek God and His righteousness.
God is all powerful. God is not constrained by human limitations, which is what Jonathan is trying to express to his armor bearer. Did I see another hand? What else can we learn? So how can we apply this to ourselves and to the church? Ken?
Sometimes we feel like if we're a small group, that we maybe aren't as effective or influential in the community or whatever, but that's not necessarily true. God can work wonders with small groups or even with one person.
Yes, 100%. So I was thinking about this board when I was thinking about this question, and oftentimes we pay attention to these numbers or this number, and we judge how well we may be doing based on this. And you think God's paying attention, and well, okay, so they've got this many, and they've got this amount, so I can then thereby do this with them? No, it doesn't matter. But we as humans, oftentimes, we constrain God because of our own thoughts, and we think that, well, we've got to have more members, or we've got to have more income or more resources financially to do more for the Lord, and that is just not the case. Go ahead, Francis.
Well, I look at the example of if we have the Bible and a bigger congregation with more people and more money have the Bible. It's how we use our resource, the Bible, and how they use their resource, the Bible, is the only difference that matters between us and God.
So we've talked about it there with the church, but we do this individually as well, where whenever we're facing, and it could be a multitude of personal challenges, it could be something with our health, it could be our own financial situation, maybe the loss of a job, it could be relationship struggles that we have, and oftentimes we again place limitations on God, and we think, well, I'm doomed. There's nothing that is going to be able to help me. And oftentimes we show our lack of faith and trust in God through those as well. So what are some ways that we can overcome that mindset, that we can have the mindset of Jonathan? Norm?
Concentrate on doing the right thing for the right reason, and then leaving the results up to God. Then you can lay your head on your pillow at night at the end of each day, knowing that you did what you could do. And that's a great way to go through life. I think God wants that for us, to have that kind of a joy of satisfaction.
Okay. So I think developing that dependence on God, and some of that is going to be through prayer and regularly talking to God in prayer. Norm P.
God demands the work, and that's it. He's the one in charge of the results. He only demands the work, and we so often get those numbers. Those represents results. That's not in our authority, our purview, our area. We are to do the work. God handles all the rest, and we may not understand that. Oh, our numbers dwindle. Our numbers keep dwindling. Why do our numbers keep dwindling? God's got a plan, and if we're doing the work, even with numbers dwindling or rising, either direction, it's according to what He needs to happen.
Yeah. And what Norm said just made me think, oftentimes we are so overwhelmed by the situation that we lose sight of God, but in other ways, we also look at what everybody else does, and we think, well, I can't do what so-and-so does, and so therefore, I'm of no use to the Lord. And no, we should serve with what we have. And with whatever talents and abilities that we have, God has called us to serve with those. Anything else on number 5? I will acknowledge, I know there's been 2 bangs, one over here and one over here. Pretty sure they're birds that are flying into the window. So I know some of you have heard them too, because I've seen heads pop up. But I think it's just birds flying into the window. Question number 6. What do we learn about Jonathan's character in chapters 13 and 14, and how does his faith contrast with his father's? What makes the difference in the faith of Saul and Jonathan? So how would you summarize his character, Jonathan's character there in chapters 13 and 14? Okay, faith and courage. Who are you pointing at, Norm P? Ms. Shirley?
Well, he had faith and courage, true, but his faith grew stronger and Saul's grew weaker.
Okay. Yeah, so we definitely see that contrast there of one faith going one direction and one going the exact opposite direction. Norm?
I like the quality of innocence that Jonathan has in his approach towards things. It's a pure. You can tell there's a purity of heart there involved in his actions. And some people might say, "Oh, maybe he's immature, he's naive, or something." Now, I look at it as an innocent, the heart of a child, the purity of spirit, wanting to do what's right, and believing that if I do what's right, then I'm doing the right thing, and that's all that matters to him.
Yeah. So in our training classes today with the young men and the young ladies, so what we're doing is each month we're going through 3 characteristics of a godly man and a godly woman, and the 3 today just happen to be courage, boldness, and wisdom. And so I think courage and boldness are definitely characteristics of Jonathan, very much so. Whenever you just think about the situation with the Philistines and his faith in that, and just with 2 people, we're going to be able to accomplish this. That takes an enormous amount of courage and an enormous amount of boldness, and that is all because of, as everyone has mentioned, the faith and the trust that he had in God. And I think that it shows just his unwavering commitment to serve the Lord and whatever the situation may be. And I think that just the opposite of Saul, it also shows this sense of selflessness. He's willing to give himself in whatever capacity necessary for the people. Because Jonathan was not doing this for glory. He didn't care about his popularity, or at least there's no indication that he cared about his popularity before the people. But he saw this was a situation. These people are coming up against God's people, and he's going to put himself out there to be the agent through which God is able to provide victory. So just with, again, looking at the contrast between Saul and Jonathan, obviously you've got, as we've talked about, some of the reasons why Saul made the excuses that he made. So we see his fear versus Jonathan's faith. We see in the situation with Saul where he kind of takes matters into, well, not kind of, he does, he takes matters into his own hands, where Jonathan is waiting on a sign from God, and he's letting his armor bearer know, if this happens, then we know that the Lord is going to be with us. So we see that patience in waiting. And then we see, obviously, as we talked about with verse 6 there, Jonathan's recognition that God's going to be able to do whatever he wants to with however many or with however few. And so he's relying on God's power. And we see Saul where he's really relying on human strength, because when he sees the army starting to scatter, now he loses heart. And it's like, okay, well, we definitely can't do what we got to do now because everybody is leaving. And I think that it all boils down to, again, their own hearts and the way that they were willing to serve God, the way that Saul was about himself and Jonathan was about the people, and just their willingness to act, or Jonathan's willingness to act in faith. Anything else on number 6, Daddy?
So Saul was the king. Saul was the leader here, and so what you have is actually his son stepping up to kind of take over or do what was right. And so I'm thinking as a comparison to today, I mean, sometimes we see in local congregations that elders fail to lead like they're supposed to. And so what you need, again, is continued faithful men in the congregation to work through that. Certainly we have to submit to our eldership, but when they start doing things like Saul did and thinking, well, how am I going to handle this? And they don't involve God in the decisions and leading the church, then it calls for sometimes, other Christian men and women to kind of work through it. It's a difficult situation. And so you think Jonathan says, I'm going to go over here and try to take care of this, but, Saul could have come down on him, what it kind of did there,
Yeah. Yeah, that's one thing that's kind of interesting to me because of the way that Jonathan proves himself, and we don't see Saul getting nearly as upset about that as he does with David here in just a little bit. But and what my dad is talking about goes back to even Samuel and when he's before the people. And yeah, we as a congregation, you can't have an attitude of, well, we have elders, and okay, well, things may not be going the way that we think that they should, and we're, comparing them to God's Word, but they're the elders, and we're supposed to submit to them. No, we're supposed to submit to God. Jonathan was submitting to God before he was going to submit to his father Saul, and so, yes, definitely something that we have to be mindful of. I've always heard, a congregation is only as strong as the preaching that it demands, but I think that is also hand in hand with making sure that the leaders are held accountable and continuing to serve God faithfully. Anything else on number 6? Ms. Shirley?
Well, I've heard people say, well, the elders decided this, and I don't agree with it, so it's on them, so they don't have any responsibility for that, but they can always go somewhere else.
So obviously when we're talking about this, we're talking about doctrinal matters. We're not going to get upset over opinions, and if the elders decide something that your opinion may be different, or we have to make sure that it's all based on God's Word and things that are of faith. Who are you pointing at, Norm? Lena, go ahead.
If we move away from him going by himself against the Philistines to the food story, you can consider him as a rational thinker. Again, it brings me more and more to him being like David, when he goes and he eats and people say, well, but your father forbid us to eat. And he rationalizes, like, why would the hungry people be stronger in battle than full people? And the Bible mentions several times they were almost fainting from being weak from not eating. Same as David always took care of his people to eat.
Yeah. And Jonathan, in that situation, obviously, he had not heard the vow that Saul had made, and he's using common sense. Like, we're in battle, everybody's tired, so let's eat. But even the way that Jonathan handles the situation after he realizes the vow that was made, what does that tell us about Jonathan? What did he do when he was presented with the fact that Saul had made this vow that he didn't know about? What was his response?
How much better I feel eating. It would be so much better if everyone could fill their bellies. And
He was going to resign himself to his father's vow.
Yes.
It shows his integrity and his, I guess, submission to the king and to his father.
Exactly. I think he actually says, "Let me die."
43, so now I must die.
Yes. So here I am, I must die. So he's willing to allow Saul to fulfill the vow that he made, and it kind of goes back to what we talked about with the rash vows with Jephthah. It didn't make any sense to Jonathan, but okay, here I am. Go ahead, Todd.
Yeah, I think that's what we should definitely connect it to. And there may be a contrast to almost all these judges, because you see Gideon, who was willing to go with fewer men, and Saul's worried about his men running away. You see this with the rash vow that Jephthah was willing to keep, and Saul was, basically looking for a way out of it. Even with Barak, who wouldn't go unless Deborah would go with him. It's kind of like Saul and Samuel sometimes. And then Jonathan's very much like Abimelech, because Abimelech wanted to be king because he was the son of somebody, and Jonathan's unwilling to assert that, which is just everything's the opposite.
Yeah, I think that with especially this kind of period, we focus so much on Saul, and obviously we focus a lot on David, but I think Jonathan is such a good Bible character for us to learn so much from. Question number 7. What character traits do we see Saul displaying in chapter 15, and how do these compare to when we first were introduced to him? 1 Samuel chapter 15 has always been one of my favorite chapters, maybe in a little bit of a bad way, because obviously we see the demise, the further demise of Saul. And we do see such a character shift. If you remember, I guess it was in the last lesson maybe when I asked the question about the positive leadership qualities and the negative leadership qualities of Saul. And in my notes for the negative, I had like so many listed, and then I said future. Well, the future is now, and the future is chapter 15. So what character traits do we see him showing here in chapter 15? Ken?
Well, I would say selfishness, unfaithfulness, presumption, cowardice.
Okay. Anybody else? So it's very similar to what we have already seen there in chapter 13, just with an overall disobedience. Again, his pride, and then once he's confronted with the situation, again, his inability to accept responsibility, showing his lack of humility. And so I think that is in complete contrast to what we talked about at the very beginning of Saul's life, with his humility in chapters 9 and 10, and his obedience that he showed there in chapter 10. And so we see that shift from again, humility to pride. We see him having a fear of the people really in the early part of his reign, even before his reign, or a fear of God, and now he has a fear of the people. And so I think that just overall, we have to understand the danger of our own pride. But one of the big things, obviously, is that obedience is so much more important than sacrifice, and God values that obedience as opposed to something where we're going through the motions and acting like we are making some form of sacrifice to God. So, Norm P?
The arrogance that he has acquired at this point in his reign, that he would boldly go out and make the decision to disobey God, to not follow through on all the commands, then to boldly go up to Samuel and say, I have done all that I've been commanded to do, and be totally happy. And when confronted with the point by point, you failed on every single point, like you did absolutely nothing that you were commanded to do. And he's like, oh, but I did. Like the absolute arrogance to come back at that.
Yeah, and I think that is, again, we're going to give Saul a hard time, but we oftentimes do the same thing where we were told to do this. Well, as long as we did a little bit of it, well, I was obedient. And that's Saul's mentality. But I did obey. No, not even close. And so that's something that we have to guard against ourselves. And we are out of time. And so we'll pick up with question number 8, and then I'll probably skip a few questions in lesson number 3, but we'll pick up with question number 8 and lesson 2 next week.